Here we are taking a look at yet another game from my childhood. This is Army of Two from EA, the original Army of Two, which is a third-person action military shooter that's geared more towards cooperative play, but pits you in this science fiction-esque narrative where private military companies are being paid for by governments to fight wars and de-escalate terrorist situations. I thought this game looked so cool back in the day, no joke. This is actually my third playthrough of the game all of these years later, but this time around I played it through on the Xbox 360, as I only had the PS3 version back when the game was initially launching. I actually first discovered this one at a friend's house, a big surprise. As I recall stating in some of my previous video, mature rated games were not something my parents were really keen on letting me experience. At least it would highly depend on what the game was rated mature for. And around this time, I was just, getting into the age where they were being a bit more relaxed on enforcing that. So I actually had GameFly back then, and this is one of those titles that I was able to get through that program. But I only first discovered this game while I was at a friend's house who actually owned the Xbox 360 version, and we played it together for quite some time. Now, the Army of Two franchise is a bit interesting in that it's one of those games that seem to have come out at just the right place and the right time. This was during an era where there was a lot of experimentation within EA, and while the Call of Duty franchise was around, it was still very much climbing the ladders to become the fully dominant multiplayer experience back then. So you had this new kind of cooperative shooter from EA, which spawned two other additional entries, a sequel and then a spin-off game, which had varying degrees of success. Now, the initial game is actually still my favorite in the franchise. It seems to be the longest entry as well, including the most story-focused. And overall, I just really enjoyed the pacing of the gunfights in this one. Now, the second game really just throws everything at you with just this intense destruction and, explosions going on. It just felt like the end of the world happening in that title, but it was also a shorter game. At least it felt shorter to me, and it felt a bit more formulaic as well. And when it came to the spin-off, The Devil's Cartel, I just remember not being so enamored with the idea that, soldiers Tyson and Rios were no longer the playable main focus. So in any case, it was quite fun replaying Army of Two. I'm going to break down my reasons why I prefer this game more so than the others and, discuss my thoughts on the presentation just a little bit. And taking a brief break to look at the box art for Army of Two on Xbox 360, I gotta say, I just really like this cover art. It has some really nice details. I love all the guns, being in the design of skyscrapers, and it just really lends itself to like this, private military corporate-esque, military shooter. It's just awesome. So yeah, cool look at the spine there. On the back, we see a couple different screenshots. It talks about the story and the world and the premise and the cooperative nature of the gameplay itself. So pretty basic there, some good information and whatnot. Now, opening this up here, I don't have a manual, unfortunately, and I only have a Platinum's disc, but the console ran this perfectly fine without any issues. So yeah, I'm afraid I can't comment on the state of the manual in this game, but just wanted to show off at least the cover art because I do like the design for this one. Now, graphically, Army of Two was quite a beautiful looking game at launch. I remember that during this time, it was when we saw really big advancements being made to graphics for the 7th generation. We sort of were getting out of that cross-generation graphics period and started leaning more heavily into sort of post-processing and high-definition effects that really lend the game a cinematic flair. I think today this game still looks good. Now, the Xbox 360 version of the game, which is what we're watching here, this initial title remains the only Army of Two game that is actually backwards compatible on the Series X, and it has no enhancements otherwise. However, this capture was actually taken from an original Xbox 360 console, so this is how the original game looks, but the Series X does help clean up the optimization issues and any screen tearing that you would have ran into on the original hardware here. You have these CGI-esque cutscenes, which are fun to watch, and you have to keep in mind that they were going for a very realistic color palette for this game. So while you spend most of your time sort of in the Middle East, you're kind of surrounded by a lot of sand, dirt, rubble as you kind of fight your way across various different terrains. But you do make your way into some jungles, and there's some decent vehicle missions as well. There's some interior, fighting too in like buildings and in more, business heavy kind of commercial areas. So it's really not the same thing over and over and over again. And I do think the marketing for this game was a bit of a turnoff for some. I do actually recall news outlets were going a bit hard on games back during this era, especially, military, shooters where the US was actually actually fighting a war with Iraq during this time. But as far as the presentation standpoint goes, graphically, I think Army of Two was a bit ahead of its time. It looked very good from the era, from what I recall. And on the PS3 version, which again is where I played it originally, you get this kind of weird border around the edges of the screen. I don't even think the PS3 version was running in HD. It was sort of a victim of cross-gen development woes. But worth noting that this was also before the era of trophies, so that version is really not the one you want to get these days. But I do recall the frame rate at least being fine, and ultimately, I was still able to enjoy the game. Now, sound design wise, I very much liked everything I heard here. I thought the voice acting was very well done. You sort of get this kind of campy dialogue, to the main characters, but I like it. It doesn't take itself overtly seriously, except when it comes down to like the more cinematic story bits. But gun sounds are awesome. You get this great soundtrack that feels kind of similar to some tracks from Call of Duty 4. So if you're into that style of music, you'll probably like what's on offer here. And there's just good bass response, explosions, and everything else throughout. I think when it comes down to the overall gameplay experience, Army of Two translates well enough into being a decently aged game. For me, the downside here is really the AI. The enemy AI can be a bit stupid, and I suppose it's all by design when it comes to the gameplay. You're supposed to play using the aggro meter to your advantage, which basically means that the person who creates the most noise on the battlefield is the one who's drawing all of the attention. So the gameplay loop in theory is to work with your partner to draw enemy fire and then flank them around by circling, through different areas, and then you kind of rinse and repeat this all throughout. But playing by yourself, this system can be a bit hit or miss. You definitely feel the game was built for co-op in mind, and you do have control to tell your AI companion what to do, but ultimately, he can just get stuck or kind of turned around, or, can just not do what you want him or ask him to do entirely. So, you kind of had to contend with sort of the issues when it comes to the AI in this game. Overall, I still really enjoyed Army of Two. I feel a bit preferable towards it because, this one in particular I started with back in the day, so I guess there's a bias there. But regardless, it's still my favorite in the franchise. I am interested to see whether replaying the 40th day, will yield a different result, and of course trying the Devil's Cartel, what that will be like. But as an initial outing, I think it's interesting to look back during this time when EA was trying to put out a good variety of games. And while not all of these games were sort of mega successful, you just get this sense the company was really trying, and I still think that there's place for a new Army of Two in today's market. To be honest, as I just said that, my heart kind of aches a bit, as I expect EA would probably take this franchise and turn it into a live service project if they re-released it today. So perhaps it is better, that it's dead rather than being ruined by that disease. But regardless, let me know what you guys think if you played this one back then. Did you play the original Army of Two or any of the other games in the franchise? I'll be checking out the other games in due time, and I'm interested to see what you guys have to say, all right? Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all later.